Laura Blumenfeld, she's a former U.S. State Department senior policy advisor on the Israeli-Palestinian negotiating team, now a senior fellow at the Johns Hopkins Merrill Center for Strategic and International Studies. Always great to have you on. We are not far away, really, from phase one of this deal expiring on Saturday. What do you think we're likely to see when this deadline hits?
Yeah, I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu is going to have a moment of decision. And I would say that it's not going to be a domestic political decision, and it's not going to be a principled decision. It's probably going to be based on President Trump, frankly, as we saw with Zelensky today. These countries are heavily dependent on the U.S., especially at war and when weapons are involved. Israel now has those heavy bombs, and the United States announced today a $3 billion deal where they're going to be releasing armored bulldozers, which had been held up under President Biden. So I do think that Netanyahu is very much going to take into account whether President Trump in this arena wants to be seen as the peacemaker or the punisher.
Well, the prime minister also probably weighing a couple of things, right? He's seen these shows of strength by Hamas while it's handing over the hostages during the first stage. And then, like we heard there in that report, there are still hostages, of course, being held in Gaza, and there must be worries about their health. So how does he balance those two things as he looks towards maybe an extension or maybe moving towards phase two?
I think that's a critical question, because in Israel, and where Prime Minister, of course, Netanyahu is very sensitive, has to be sensitive to public domestic opinion. There was a real emotional turning point this week where they buried a mother and her two sons in one single grave, and an 83-year-old man who had survived many challenges in life, and all of them were murdered hostages in Gaza. And I think that the Israelis saw, on the one hand, were horrified by not just Hamas celebrating these kind of ghoulish handovers, but also regular Palestinians. And there was kind of a loss of empathy for them. On the other hand, there are 25 living hostages who are, haunted and gaunt, and who are now testifying and advocating for the release of their brethren who are still being held in Gaza. So I think that puts tremendous pressure on Netanyahu not to go back to war, although he is saber rattling and saying that he can. There's a new U.S. administration that's backing him. There's a new chairman of the Joint Chiefs, a new Israeli commander-in-chief who's coming in. And there's also a new Secretary of Defense under, Israeli.
And you mentioned the latest shipment of weapons from the U.S. to Israel. I mean, how would you weigh that? What are the chances, do you think, that Israel would take this opportunity between the two phases to maybe ramp up strikes on Gaza once again?
Well, here's what's really important to keep in mind when you think about the IDF, is that every soldier, when they have an operational order, the last line on that operational order says that if you fall behind enemy lines, we will bring you home. And that, as the Israelis like to say, is kind of their secret weapon. So the hostages that are still being held in Gaza, they're young men, they're either soldiers or they're fighting age. And so it's a sort of almost a societal commitment, a moral and a strategic commitment to do everything to bring them home. So this kind of tension between defeating Hamas militarily and rescuing the hostages is really coming to a fine point in this week, as they have to decide which will it be. And if I had to guess, it's going to be to bring the hostages home. That's what holds Israeli society together, and it gives strength to the military.
And Laura, let's look at Hamas before I let you go. It's confirmed that it wants to stick to this original agreement, which would see the two sides move to phase two. But do you think it would be willing to make some sort of deal to extend this phase one that we're seeing right now and to extend the ceasefire a bit longer?
Potentially for a couple of reasons. One of them is, Ramadan. So it's the holy month starting today, starting tonight. And perhaps they'd like to see, it's traditional actually, that there are prisoner releases during Ramadan. So they could very much benefit from the idea of a prisoner exchange for hostages. There are some very high profile Palestinian prisoners who were released even this week. Al-Adin Bazian, he was arrested and imprisoned in 1986, if you think about it, for the killing point blank, a bullet in the head of a British tourist, Paul Appleby, a 27-year-old young Christian sitting outside of the Garden Tomb. He's been imprisoned, Al-Adin Bazian, for 42 years, and he was released this week. So if Hamas has the kind of incentive for them to be seen, what they call is the flood of freedom, which they can bring to their prisoners, that might just give them incentive to say, okay, we'll overlook this agreement about phase two and continue with phase one. But guess what? The price is going to go up let's start with 150 prisoners for one Israeli. It will surely not be the same exchange rate.
Laura Blumenfeld, always great to get your perspective. Thank you.